I want to talk to you about something that sounds like a riddle or perhaps a magic trick. Every major nation on earth is drowning in debt. The United States owes $38 trillion. China, 18 trillion. Japan carries debt worth 230% of its entire economy. The United Kingdom, France, Germany, all deeply in the red. And yet, somehow, the world keeps turning. Money keeps flowing. Markets function. So here's the puzzle that keeps people awake at night. If everyone is in debt, who exactly is doing the lending? Where does all this money come from? It's a perfectly reasonable question. When you borrow money from a bank, the bank has that money. It came from somewhere: depositors, investors, the bank's capital. There's a lender and a borrower. Simple. But when we scale this up to nations, something very strange happens. The arithmetic stops making intuitive sense. Let me walk you through what's actually happening, because the answer is far more interesting than most people realize. And I should warn you, once you understand how this system really works, you'll never look at economics the same way again. Let's start with the United States, because it's the easiest case to examine. As of October 2025, American federal debt hit $38 trillion. That's not a typo. 38 trillion. To put that in perspective, if you spend $1 million every single day, it would take you more than 100,000 years to spend that much money. Now, who holds this debt? Who are these mysterious lenders? The first answer might surprise you: Americans themselves. The largest single holder of United States government debt is actually the Federal Reserve, America's central bank. They own roughly $6.7 trillion of Treasury securities. Think about that for a moment. The American government owes money to the American government's bank, but that's just the beginning. Another 7 trillion is held in what we call intragovernmental holdings. This is the government owing money to itself. The Social Security Trust Fund owns 2.8 trillion of United States debt. The Military Retirement Fund owns another 1.6 trillion. Medicare holds a substantial chunk. So the government borrows from Social Security to fund other programs and promises to pay it back later. It's like borrowing from your left pocket to pay your right pocket. So far, we're at about $13 trillion that America essentially owes to itself. That's more than a third of the total debt already. The question, who's the lender, becomes strange, doesn't it? But let's continue. The next big category is private domestic investors, ordinary Americans, through various channels. Mutual funds hold about 3.7 trillion. State and local governments own 1.7 trillion. Banks, insurance companies, pension funds. Together, private American investors hold roughly $24 trillion of United States debt. Now, this is where it gets fascinating. Where did these pension funds and mutual funds get their money? From American workers, from retirement accounts, from ordinary people saving for their future. So, in a very real sense, the American government is borrowing from its own citizens. Let me tell you a story about how this works in practice. Imagine a school teacher in California. She's 55 years old, been teaching for 30 years. Every month, a portion of her salary goes into her pension fund. That pension fund needs to invest that money somewhere safe, somewhere that will reliably pay returns, so she can retire comfortably. What could be safer than lending to the United States government? So her pension fund buys treasury bonds. That same teacher probably worries about the national debt. She's heard the news, seen the frightening numbers, and she's right to be concerned. But here's the twist. She is one of the lenders. Her retirement depends on the government continuing to borrow money and pay interest on those bonds. If the United States suddenly paid off all its debt tomorrow, her pension fund would lose one of its safest, most reliable investments. This is the first big secret of government debt in wealthy countries. The citizens are simultaneously the borrowers. They benefit from government spending, and the lenders. Their savings, their pensions, their insurance policies, all invested in government bonds. Now, the fourth category, foreign investors. This is what most people think of when they imagine who holds American debt. China owns about $760 billion. Japan owns 1.1 trillion. The United Kingdom owns 723 billion. In total, foreign investors, both governments and private entities, hold about $8.5 trillion of United States debt, roughly 30% of the publicly held portion. But here's what's interesting about foreign holdings. Why do other countries buy American debt? Let's take Japan as an example. Japan has the world's third largest economy. They export cars, electronics, machinery to the United States. Americans buy these products with dollars. Japanese companies earn those dollars. Now what? Well, those companies need to convert dollars into yen to pay their workers and suppliers back home. But if they all try to exchange their dollars at once, the yen would strengthen dramatically, making Japanese exports more expensive and less competitive. So what does Japan do? The Bank of Japan buys those dollars and invests them in United States Treasury securities. It's a way to recycle trade imbalances. Think of it this way. America buys physical goods from Japan, Sony televisions, Toyota cars. Japan takes those dollars and buys American financial assets, treasury bonds. The money flows in a circle. The debt is just the accounting record of that circular flow. China operates on the same principle, though their motivations are more complex. For years, China deliberately kept its currency weak to boost exports. They accumulated massive dollar reserves. What do you do with $3 trillion? You can't exactly stuff it under a mattress. The United States Treasury market is one of the few places deep enough and liquid enough to absorb that much money. So they buy treasury bonds. This brings us to a crucial point for much of the world. United States government debt isn't a burden being forced on unwilling lenders. It's an asset they want to own. Treasury bonds are considered the safest financial asset in the world. When uncertainty strikes, a war, a pandemic, a financial crisis, money floods into United States treasuries. It's called flight to safety. But I've been focusing on America. What about the rest of the world? Because this is a global phenomenon. Global public debt now stands at $111 trillion. That's 95% of the entire world's economic output. The debt has grown by $8 trillion in just 1 year. And here's the crucial fact. The United States and China together account for more than half of all government debt in the world. 38 trillion for the United States, 18 trillion for China. These two countries are essentially the anchors of the global debt system. Japan presents perhaps the most extreme case. Japanese government debt is 230% of gross domestic product. If Japan were a person, this would be like earning £50,000 a year and owing 115,000 bankruptcy territory, right? And yet, Japan continues to function. Interest rates on Japanese government bonds are close to zero, sometimes even negative. Why? Because Japanese citizens buy the bonds. Japan's debt is almost entirely held domestically. Japanese banks, Japanese pension funds, Japanese insurance companies, Japanese households, they own 90% of Japanese government debt. Think about the psychology of that for a moment. Japanese people are famous for being high savers. They sock away money diligently. But where does that money go? Into government bonds, because they're perceived as the safest place to store wealth. And what does the government do with that borrowed money? It spends it on schools, hospitals, infrastructure, pensions, benefiting those same citizens. It's a closed loop. Now, we come to the mechanism that really explains how this entire system works. It's something that sounds arcane, but it's absolutely fundamental. Quantitative easing, or as it's sometimes called, QE. Here's what quantitative easing actually is. Central banks create money out of thin air. And I mean literally create it. Digitally, with keystrokes, and use that newly created money to buy government bonds. Let me say that again, because it's important. The Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, they don't have to find money somewhere to lend to their governments. They create it. They increase the numbers in their accounts. That money didn't exist before. Now it does. During the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, the Federal Reserve created about $3.5 trillion this way. During the COVID pandemic, they created another 4 trillion. The money didn't come from anywhere. It was simply created. Now, before you think this is some kind of elaborate fraud, let me explain why central banks do this and how it's supposed to work. During a crisis, a financial meltdown, a pandemic, the economy seizes up. People stop spending because they're afraid. Businesses stop investing because there's no demand. Banks stop lending because they're worried about defaults. This creates a vicious cycle. Less spending means less income, means less spending. The government needs to step in, build hospitals, send stimulus checks, save failing banks, whatever the emergency requires. But the government also needs to borrow enormous amounts of money to do this. In normal times, there might not be enough willing lenders at reasonable interest rates. So the central bank steps in, it creates money and buys government bonds, keeping interest rates low and ensuring the government can borrow what it needs. The theory is that this newly created money will flow into the economy, encouraging lending and spending, and help end the recession. Once the economy recovers, the central bank can reverse the process, sell those bonds back into the market, destroying the money, bringing things back to normal. That's the theory. Reality is more complicated. The first round of quantitative easing after the financial crisis seemed to work reasonably well. It prevented a complete economic collapse. But here's what else happened. Asset prices exploded. Stock markets soared. Real estate prices jumped. Why? Because all that newly created money ended up in the hands of banks and financial institutions. They didn't necessarily lend it out to small businesses or home buyers. Instead, they bought stocks, bonds, and property. The wealthy, who own most financial assets, got much wealthier. Research by the Bank of England estimated that quantitative easing boosted stock and bond prices by about 20%. Sounds good. Until you realize that 40% of the stock market is owned by the wealthiest 5% of the population. The richest 5% of British households became about £128,000 wealthier on average. Meanwhile, families who owned little to no financial assets saw minimal benefit. This is one of the great ironies of modern economic policy. We create money to save the economy, but that money disproportionately benefits those who are already wealthy. The system works, but it exacerbates inequality. Now, let's talk about the cost of all this debt. Because debt isn't free. It accumulates interest. The United States paid interest of $1 trillion in fiscal year 2025. That's right, $1 trillion just in interest payments. That's more than the country spends on its entire military. It's the second largest item in the federal budget, behind only Social Security. And that number is rising fast. Interest payments nearly tripled over 3 years, from $497 billion in 2022 to $909 billion in 2024. By 2035, interest payments are projected to reach $1.8 trillion per year over the next decade. The United States government will spend $13.8 trillion just on interest. Not on schools, roads, healthcare, or defense. Just on interest. Think about what that means. Every pound, every dollar, every euro paid in interest is money that cannot be spent on anything else. It's not building infrastructure. It's not funding research. It's not helping the poor. It's just paying interest to bondholders. And here's the cruel mathematics. As debt grows, interest payments grow. As interest payments grow, deficits grow. As deficits grow, more borrowing is needed. As more borrowing happens, debt grows. It's a feedback loop. The Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2034, interest costs will consume roughly 4% of America's entire economic output. They'll account for 22% of all federal revenues, meaning more than $1 in 5 collected in taxes will go purely to interest payments. But America isn't alone in this predicament. Across the OECD, the club of wealthy nations, interest payments now average 3.3% of gross domestic product. That's more than these governments collectively spend on defense. More than 3.4 billion people worldwide live in countries where interest payments on government debt exceed what those governments spend on either education or healthcare. Think about that. There are countries where the government pays more to bondholders than it spends on teaching children or treating the sick. For developing nations, the situation is even more dire. Poor countries paid a record $96 billion to service their external debt in 2023. Their interest costs hit $34.6 billion, 4 times what they paid a decade ago. Some countries are paying 38% of their export earnings just on interest. That's money that could modernize their economies, build infrastructure,